You remember the sound, even if you never knew it was a Gardner, the slow, patient beat of the bus that took you to school, the thrum under half the lorries on every trunk road in Britain. At its peak, the works at Patricroft employed close to 3,000 people and put engines into 75,000 vehicles across 58 countries. They survived 2 world wars, survived the death of their founder, the Depression, the wholesale remaking of British transport. They built an engine so over-engineered the trade swore it would run forever, the engine that powered nearly 90% of every bus in the country. And then, after more than a century of making, the works fell silent. It didn't fade the way most firms do, worn down slowly from the outside. It was brought down by a single decision, a single mistake, made by one man inside those walls who could have saved it and chose not to. What did he refuse to do? Chapter 1. The Cellar on Upper Duke Street. The story begins, as so many British industrial stories do, with a man, a small idea, and not much money. Manchester, 1868. A brass plate, screwed to the wall of a rented cottage off Stretford Road, in the district of Hume. It read, simply, L. Gardner, machinist. The machinist was Lawrence Gardner, and his beginnings were as precarious as any in that city of arrivals. He'd been born in Liverpool in 1840, the son of Thomas Gardner, recorded in some places as a labourer, in others as a miller, a man who died while Lawrence was still a boy. By the census of 1851, the widow and her children were living in lodgings in a Liverpool swollen with the destitute Irish who'd fled the Great Famine. Out of that kind of insecurity, a particular sort of ambition tends to grow. A hunger for self-reliance, for something solid that no landlord and no hard winter could take away. In 1861, he married Anne Kynaston, herself a miller's daughter, and 7 years later he set up on his own account. There was a wrinkle, though. He could afford the brass plate and the rent on one of 4 cottages. What he couldn't afford was a workshop, so he took the only space available to him, the communal cellar shared by all 4 houses. Equipping that cellar is where the folklore of Gardner precision actually begins, not with triumph, but with comedy. A 10.5-inch lathe and an 8-foot boiler had to be got down into a basement that had never been meant for machinery. The solution was rope and nerve. The tools were lowered through a pavement trapdoor on pulleys slung from planks, shoved out of an upstairs bedroom window. The paving stones, as one account dryly notes, suffered as a consequence. Then the landlord nearly ended it before it began. When tenants defaulted on their rent, he threatened to seize whatever was inside, including Lawrence's hard-won machines. So Lawrence did the only thing that could secure his foothold. He took out a building society loan at 31 shillings and 6pence a week and bought the cottages outright. Everything he had, mortgaged to keep the tools he'd risked the pavement to install. And what he made in that cellar tells you everything about the mind at work. Sewing machine parts, a machine to score cardboard, and another to cut dovetails into it, a cloth-cutting machine, even a coffee roaster, 4 drums heated by gas. There was no buying in of half-finished components, no shortcuts. Gears were cut from solid brass and filed by hand, and filed so accurately that they could be used as the patterns for castings. The standard was set early, and it was absolute. A Gardner part was right, or it was made again. There's a parallel here that was drawn even at the time, and it's almost too neat to be true. A few streets away, off the same Stretford Road, another miller's son was beginning his own career in dynamos and precision before cheap imports pushed him towards something finer. His name was Henry Royce. 2 Manchester men, 2 millers' sons, both destined to put their names on machines that meant quality, one at the very top of the motor car, the other at the very heart of the working lorry. The household over the cellar grew to 8 children, 6 sons and 2 daughters, and every one of the boys would take his place in the business. Lawrence had built something that would outlast him, which was just as well, because in 1890 he died at only 50 years old. He left the firm to his widow and to his eldest son, Thomas Harry Gardner, then approaching 30, who took the helm alongside his brother Edward. And when, in time, the brothers, Thomas, Edward, Lawrence, Ernest, and Joseph, came to incorporate the company, they made a choice that says more than any balance sheet. They could have called it Gardner Brothers. It was, by then, their firm. But they named it L. Gardner and Sons, a deliberate act of devotion to a self-taught father, a man whose own lack of schooling had once strained things with an ambitious eldest boy. The Sons kept the father's name above the door. That was the kind of company it intended to be. Chapter 2. Fourpence a gallon. The firm that grew out of that cellar moved up in the world, quite literally. First to Cornbrook Park Road, then in 1891 to Lund Street, where it now employed 80 men and had found a brisk and slightly unexpected trade. It built dynamos, the heaviest weighing 3 tons, and, of all things, dental chairs, 106 of them in the first 3 years alone. But the future wasn't in dynamos or dentistry. From 1891, Gardner took up the Robinson patent hot air engine, and with it, the firm crossed a threshold. It had become a maker of engines. Gas engines followed on the Otto 4-stroke cycle from May 1894. Then oil-fueled engines from around 1897. The horizontal designs gave way to vertical ones. Step by step, almost without anyone declaring it, a machine shop was turning into an engine works, and in 1899 it found the home its name would be welded to forever, the Barton Hall Engine Works at Patricroft in Eccles, just to the west of Manchester. The setting could hardly have been more fitting. The works stood beside the world's first intercity railway line and alongside the Bridgewater Canal, the artery that had helped start the whole industrial revolution. Gardner had planted itself at the very source of the thing it was about to serve. In 1903, the firm became a limited company, and diesel engine production began. To sell what it made, it appointed the London agents Norris and Henty, and by 1912 had folded them into a sales arm of its own, Norris, Henty, and Gardner's. The engines were finding their way into boats, into generators, into the standing machinery of a country that ran on belts and flywheels. Then came the first great test. In the First World War, Gardner turned to munitions and to parts for heavy guns, and it was handed an extraordinary commission. It was one of just 9 firms ordered to build, under license, a total of 5,342 Ricardo engines, 150 horsepower apiece, for the Mark V tank. The little Manchester machinist's shop was now helping to power the most fearsome weapon the British Army possessed. But the moment that truly made Gardner, the moment that turned a respected engine builder into an industrial empire, arrived almost by accident, and it arrived on a bus. In 1929, a Nottingham operator named Trevor Barton did something nobody had quite done before. He took a heavy Gardner Marine diesel, a 4L2, and dropped it into a petrol-engined Lancia bus, just to see. The result wasn't an improvement, it was a transformation. Petrol was running at 1 and 6 a gallon. Diesel cost 4p. The economy was so absolute, so impossible to argue with, that word spread through the haulage and bus trade like fire across dry grass. Almost overnight, Gardner found itself not a niche engineer, but a major supplier to the roads of Britain. The firm answered the moment with the engine that would define it. In 1931 came the LW series, the letters standing for lightweight, a clever modular design built up from 2- and 3-cylinder sections, with cast-iron blocks and heads sitting on a light aluminium alloy crankcase. It lifted the power-to-weight ratio by more than 60%. The L2 followed in 1932, the alloy 4LK in 1935. These were naturally aspirated, direct-injection engines that achieved fuel efficiencies above 40% and, crucially, gave a wide, flat band of pulling power from low revolutions, a torque curve that drivers simply loved. That flat curve was the secret. It was what made a Gardner sip fuel where other engines gulped it. So refined were these engines that, in the 1930s, Gardner diesels were fitted to luxury cars, to Lagondas, to Bentleys, even to Rolls-Royces. A Gardner-engined Bentley, driven by Lord de Clifford, came 5th in the 1933 Monte Carlo Rally. 2 tons of motor car, returning 30 miles to the gallon at a top speed of 80 miles an hour. By the end of the decade, the firm employed nearly 3,000 people across a site of more than 30,000 square meters and was turning out some 3,500 engines a year. Then the country went to war again, and Gardner went with it. This time the work was mostly its own, building diesels of Gardner design for the fight. The most haunting of these was also the smallest. The little 4LK bus engine, the one meant to push a single-decker around a market town, was chosen to power the Royal Navy's midget submarines, the tiny X-craft that slipped into a Norwegian fjord and crippled the German battleship Tirpitz where the bombers had failed. Twin 6LW sets powered the trawlers and minesweepers that kept the sea lanes open. Gardner came through the war intact, its reputation burnished, its order books deep. It had survived 2 world wars, the death of its founder, a depression, and the wholesale reinvention of British transport, and it emerged into the 1950s as something close to a national institution, the quiet, unglamorous heart of the machines that moved a nation. Chapter 3. The Works Floor. To understand what happened next, you have to stand inside the works at Patricroft and feel how it ran, because the thing that made Gardner great and the thing that would one day kill it were the same thing. A philosophy, a way of building an engine that no one inside those walls was ever willing to compromise. Imagine arriving for a shift in the 1960s. The Barton Hall Works didn't roar the way a press shop roared. It hummed. It was a place of fitters and turners and testers, of men who measured things to tolerances finer than a human hair and took it personally if a component drifted. The air carried machine oil and the warm, particular smell of diesel run on a test bed, and running through all of it, the slow, deliberate beat of engines under test, a sound so distinctive that an old hand could tell you which model was turning over from the next room. At the centre of that culture stood one man. Hugh Gardner had come to the works in 1921, around the age of 20, for 14 shillings a week, testing engines in the number 10 test shop. He was a grandson of the firm, but he came up through the floor, not the boardroom. Away from the works, he raced Nortons on the hard sand at Southport and ran an Invicta he'd fitted with a light alloy Gardner oil engine of his own. He was, by every account that survives, obsessed, and the word recurs again and again, with one idea above all others, wringing the absolute maximum of efficiency and longevity out of an engine. The Gardner philosophy, the one Hugh inherited and then perfected, ran counter to the instincts of almost every other engine maker. Where others chased power by pushing their engines harder, Gardner deliberately held back. The compression ratio on the engines was kept in check, 15:1, not unusually high, so that every other component was stressed less, ran cooler, lasted longer. Then, having given themselves that margin, they chased perfection everywhere else, through precision, through refinement, through the kind of hand finishing that cost money and time and didn't show up in a brochure. From 1958, Hugh and his cousin John Gardner began designing and testing a more modern range to carry the firm forward. The LX series. The 6LX displaced 10.5 litres and gave 150 brake horsepower. Uprated in 1967, it became the engine that would become legend, the 6LXB. 180 brake horsepower. And, more importantly than the power, 562 pound-feet of torque, arriving at just 1,000 revolutions a minute. An 8-cylinder version, the 8LX, gave 240 brake horsepower and was called by those who knew the smoothest-running automotive diesel ever built. Here is the figure that explains the obsession. When a 6LXB was put on the testbed and run flat out, it converted its fuel into useful work at an overall thermal efficiency of 39.73%, and eased slightly below maximum. It could climb past 40. For a naturally aspirated diesel, that was not merely good, it was extraordinary. It was the number Hugh Gardner had spent his life chasing, and he had caught it. So when you picture the men on that floor, picture them building not just an engine, but a proof. Every 6LXB that came off the test bed and out through the gates carried Hugh Gardner's conviction inside it that the right way to build an engine was to understress it, overbuild it, and let it run for the rest of its natural life without complaint. It was a beautiful idea. It was, on its own terms, entirely correct, and it left almost no room for the one thing the world was about to demand. Chapter 4. The Sound of a Gardner. For a generation of British drivers, the reputation was close to mystical. A Gardner, they'd tell you, would run forever. The warranty claims for terminal failure were so rare as to be almost theoretical. The engine sipped its fuel, pulled from low down, and was so overbuilt and understressed that it simply refused to wear out. The trade told stories about it, the way trades tell stories about the things they love. There was the one, passed from depot to depot, about a municipal bus pulled out of service at 500,000 miles, its Gardner engine cut clean in half, shipped to Brazil, welded back together, and run for another 1.5 million. Whether it ever happened scarcely matters. That men believed it and repeated it tells you what a Gardner meant, and there was the sound. Among bus enthusiasts, the engine had a signature all its own, a slow, deliberate, almost musical beat, a soft, mechanical tick at idle that opened into a smooth thrum under load. A Gardner-powered bus could be identified by ear before it ever came into view around the corner. People who grew up in those towns carried that sound in their heads for the rest of their lives, most of them never knowing the name of the thing that made it. Because that's the quiet truth of it. Into the mid-1980s, a Gardner engine powered almost 90% of every bus built in Britain and appeared on the options list of every single British truck manufacturer. The bus to school, the bus to work, the lorry on every trunk road. Very often, underneath, the same engine from the same works in Eccles. The truck builders of the Cheshire and Lancashire heartland, Foden, Atkinson, Guy, Seddon, built their entire reputations on a familiar recipe: a Gardner engine, a David Brown gearbox, a rugged cab. One firm owed its very existence to the engine. In 1933, a man named Edwin Richard Foden, frustrated that his family firm was hesitating over diesel, walked out to build his own diesel lorries, powered by Gardner. He called the company ERF after his initials. The very first ERF was given the chassis number 63 because that was Edwin's age. Under the bonnet sat a Gardner 4LW. Behind it, a David Brown gearbox. Beneath it, Kirkstall Forge axles. It was shown at Olympia at the end of that year, an entire marque born to carry a Gardner engine. By the golden years, the demand had outrun anything the works could supply. An operator who wanted a new Gardner-engined lorry could face a reported wait of 2 years. 2 years for an engine, because nothing else would do. By the firm's own later reckoning, there were 75,000 vehicles in 58 countries running on Gardner power, built by a workforce that in the good times approached 3,000. But the deepest measure of what Gardner was isn't in the export figures. It's in the texture of ordinary life it quietly held up. The narrowboat easing along the canal on a summer afternoon. Gardner. The fishing boat working off the coast in the dark before dawn. Gardner. And to this day, the generator humming behind the waltzers and the dodgems at the travelling fair, where the 10.5-litre 6LXB remains the showman's engine of choice precisely because it will start and run and never let you down on a wet Friday night in a field. That was Gardner at its height. Not a household name like Rolls-Royce or the Spitfire. A name half of Britain lived alongside every single day without ever learning it. And that may be the truest kind of greatness there is, to be everywhere, indispensable, and almost entirely unseen. Chapter 5. The Summit. By the early 1970s, Gardner stood at the top, the most admired, most desired, most trusted heavy engine in Britain. An order for a Gardner-engined lorry was still a thing worth waiting years for. The works hummed. The reputation was total. And here is the cruelty at the heart of this story. At that exact summit, the highest point Gardner ever reached, the ground was already shifting beneath it, and it was shifting precisely because of the things that had made the firm great. The M1 had opened in 1959, and through the 60s and 70s, the motorway network spread across the country. The rules changed with the roads. Permitted weights climbed toward 32 tons, and then heavier still, toward the 38-ton articulated lorries that would come to rule the trunk routes. And the men who drove and owned those lorries began to want something different from their engines. A haulier running flat out on a motorway at maximum weight with a schedule to keep no longer dreamed of an engine that sipped fuel at 180 horsepower. He needed to hold his speed up the long gradients. He needed to keep pace with the traffic streaming past him. He needed to turn his loads around faster because time was money in a way it had never quite been before. He needed power, more power than a naturally aspirated engine could easily give. And there was, by now, a well-understood way to find it. You forced more air into the cylinders so they could burn more fuel. You fitted a turbocharger. The flat, gentle, economical torque curve that drivers had loved for 40 years was becoming, in the new arithmetic of the motorway, a quiet liability. The very restraint that Hugh Gardner had built into his engines, the held-back compression, the refusal to stress the metal, the whole beautiful philosophy of the understressed machine, was about to be measured against a single brutal number on a brochure, Horsepower. Standing on that summit, the works full, the order book deep, the reputation unmatched, almost no one inside the gates at Patricroft could see the cliff edge they were already walking toward. But it was there, and the decision that would send the firm over it had not yet been made. It was about to be. Chapter 6. The Men Who Brought Power. The threat did not arrive in a single moment. It gathered, and for a long time, the men inside Patricroft could afford not to take it seriously, because Gardner was Gardner, and everyone else was everyone else. But the everyone else had names, and the most important of them was an American firm called Cummins. Cummins built diesel engines on a different principle from Gardner, not the principle of restraint, but the principle of force. Where Gardner held its compression back and chased efficiency through precision, Cummins fitted turbochargers and chased power through air. The Cummins N-Series offered 250 brake horsepower and beyond, with torque that left the Gardner standing, and it did it in a package that was smaller, lighter, and simpler for a fitter to service in a cold yard at 6 in the morning. Operators noticed the fuel bills. A Gardner sipped, while a Cummins liked a good glug. But increasingly, they decided the fuel bill was a price worth paying for the power, and Cummins came to Britain to stay. It opened a plant at Shotts, in Scotland, and built engines on British soil, for British lorries, sold by men who understood the British haulier. In 1982, it would launch the L10, 8.9 litres, an engine that slid neatly under the cab, gave the driver his road speed and the mechanic his easy life, and asked nothing of either of them except that they abandon the habit of a lifetime. Then there was Rolls-Royce, not the aero-engine empire, but its diesel division at Shrewsbury, which in 1966 had launched the Eagle range, 205 to 300 brake horsepower. The Eagle had been developed for one stark, telling reason. As the engineers there saw it, Gardner was already underpowered for the market that was coming. Rolls-Royce had looked at the king of the road and concluded, years ahead of almost everyone, that the king was going to be left behind. The truth of how far things had moved can be read in the order books of Gardner's own most loyal customer. ERF, the company Edwin Foden had founded specifically to carry Gardner engines, had begun offering alternatives surprisingly early. A Rolls-Royce option from 1958, the first Cummins-powered ERF, a KV 8-wheeler in September 1961, and by the middle of the 1970s, ERF's own records tell a quiet, devastating story, as many operators were now choosing Cummins or Rolls-Royce power as were specifying Gardner's. Read that again, slowly, because it is the whole tragedy in a single line. The company that existed because of Gardner was, by the mid-70s, selling as many trucks with someone else's engine inside. The market had split into three: Gardner, Cummins, and Rolls-Royce, sharing the British heavy truck trade roughly between them. But two of those three were selling power and rising, and one of them was selling 180 horsepower and a philosophy and a 2-year waiting list, and was about to discover that loyalty, like fuel economy, has a limit. The solution was obvious. Everyone outside the gates could see it. Gardner needed to turbocharge. It needed to take its magnificent, overbuilt, under-stressed engine and force air into it and give the hauliers the numbers they were begging for. There was only one man who could authorize that, and he had already made up his mind. Chapter 7. The Faith That Would Not Bend. To understand the decision that killed Gardner, you have to resist the easy word. The easy word is stubbornness, and stubbornness isn't quite it. What Hugh Gardner had was faith, a coherent, hard-won, lifelong conviction about what an engine was for and how it ought to be built, earned across half a century on the test shop floor. To him, the matter was not commercial. It was almost moral. Consider what a turbocharger actually does through his eyes. It spins a turbine in the white-hot exhaust stream at enormous speed and enormous temperature to cram compressed air into the cylinders so that more fuel can be burned. It buys power, real power, but it buys it with heat and pressure and complication and more parts that can fail. To a man who had spent his whole working life removing stress from his engines, deliberately holding the compression back so the metal would last a lifetime, the turbocharger looked like a bargain with the devil. It offered the one thing the market wanted by sacrificing the very things that made a Gardner: the reliability, the longevity, the beautiful efficiency that he had chased to within a fraction of a perfect number. He was not wrong about the trade-off. That is the part the easy story leaves out. In the abstract, in the pure engineering of it, Hugh Gardner had a real point. A turbocharged engine does run hotter and harder. It does introduce failure modes a naturally aspirated engine never has. He had built his name and his firm's name on engines that did not break, and he genuinely believed that bolting a turbine to the exhaust was the first step toward becoming ordinary. What he got catastrophically wrong was not the engineering. It was the market. He believed the haulier would, in the end, value what he valued, the engine that ran forever, the fuel saved over 250,000 miles, the craft of the thing. He believed turbocharging was a passing enthusiasm and that the trade would come back to its senses, and to him. The trade did not come back. The trade wanted power, and it wanted it now, and it bought it from whoever would sell it. And so the most consequential decision in the history of Gardner and Sons was, in the end, a decision not to act. Not a dramatic blunder in a boardroom. No single catastrophic meeting. Just a quiet, immovable certainty, held by the one man whose certainty governed everything, that the future everyone else could see was a fashion he need not follow. The engines stayed as they were. The naturally aspirated 6LXB held at 180 horsepower, while Cummins climbed past 250. A later push produced the 6LXC, which reached around 200. And even that felt, to a market sprinting away, like a man walking briskly after a departing train. Hugh Gardner had built the most trusted engine in Britain by refusing to compromise. And now, by refusing to compromise, he would lose it. The very quality of mind that made the firm great had become the thing that could not save it. Chapter 8. The Nephew's Secret. The most painful moment in this whole story did not happen in a boardroom, or on a balance sheet, or in the order book of a customer drifting away. It happened inside the family. Hugh Gardner had a nephew, Paul Gardner, and Paul, unlike his uncle, understood exactly where the world was going. He could see the Cummins engines arriving, the Rolls-Royce Eagles climbing, the loyal customers slipping away one specification at a time. He could see that turbocharging was not a fad. It was the future, and the future was already here. So Paul did the only thing a man who loves a company and disagrees with its master can do. He worked in secret. Quietly, away from his uncle's eye, he began experimenting with a turbocharged Gardner engine, trying to prove, with metal and fuel and a test bed, that the thing could be done, and done the Gardner way, without throwing the firm's soul away. Hugh found out, and the response was absolute. He issued an ultimatum. Stop the experiment, or he would resign. The choice was put not as a discussion, but as a wall. The future of the company, being built in secret inside its own walls by a man who could see it clearly, was ordered to stop. And it stopped. The genius who had made Gardner's reputation used that reputation, and his authority, to suppress the one thing that might have carried the firm across the gap that was opening beneath it. There is no villainy in that scene. That is what makes it unbearable. A man defending the thing he had given his life to, against a younger man trying to save it, both of them right in their own way. And the firm caught between them, losing the argument either way. While the family fought its quiet war, control of the firm was slipping out of the family's hands altogether. The pressure showed first on the share register. In June 1976, Rolls-Royce, the very company building the Eagle engines that were taking Gardner's customers, acquired a 17% shareholding. In April 1977, Gardner made a defensive move of its own, buying 8.5% of ERF, trying to lock in the customer it could feel slipping away. But it was too small a hand to play. By December 1977, the whole company had been bought by the industrial conglomerate Hawker Siddeley through a cash offer for its shares. The takeover ended the Gardner family's control of the firm that bore their name. Hugh and John Gardner were, in the cold phrase one history uses, rendered surplus to requirements, and stepped down from the board. Hugh's retirement is dated to 1978. The brass plate had read Gardner and Sons for 109 years. Now the sons were gone, and there is one more turn of the knife. When Rolls-Royce's own diesel troubles offered Gardner a chance to buy the Shrewsbury commercial engine plant, a foothold into military markets and a route to the very technology it lacked, a chance that Paul Gardner urged the firm to seize, the idea was let go. By the time the competition had been properly understood inside Patricroft, the competition had already gone past. The turbocharged Gardners did come eventually. The 6LX CT at around 230 horsepower, the 6LX DT at 270 and more, the 6LYT of 1986, 15.5 litres, 320 to 350 horsepower. But they came late, under new ownership, and developed in a hurry, and the verdict of the trade was merciless, rushed into production, and never holding a candle to the engines that came before. The reliability that had been Gardner's entire identity now deserted its newest products. ERF, the firm Gardner was built to serve, took some of its early turbocharged Gardner-powered lorries and quietly refitted them with Cummins engines after a poor first year. The future had arrived at Patricroft at last. It had simply arrived too late and wearing the wrong face. Chapter 9. The Custodians. The men on the floor did not go quietly. That is the part of this story that deserves to be remembered as clearly as the engines. Patricroft had a tradition of standing its ground. In 1973, a 13-week occupation over pay had ended in victory and had taught the shop floor a lesson it did not forget, that the men who built the engines had power of their own if they chose to use it together. So, when Hawker Siddeley, in 1980, announced redundancies, the figure is given as 590 in one account, 500 in another, against a workforce of around 2,500. The response was not resignation. It was occupation. In October 1980, the workers took the Patricroft works, not to wreck it, to hold it. They declared themselves its custodians. "We believe it is our factory anyway," one steward put it, "and we have elected to become custodians of it." And they ran it. They organized the canteen, the picket rosters, the safety checks, a hardship fund for families with no wage coming in. They had leaders, and the leaders had names. The convener was Tommy McAfee, a toolroom engineer, a Communist Party man, elected only the year before. The senior shop steward was Mick Brightman, from the milling section. The steward, Kevin Cohen, would remember sections of the works determined to fight whatever anyone above them decided. And it worked. Dockers agreed to refuse to handle Hawker Siddeley goods. The pressure built, and the company gave way. It withdrew the redundancy notices. On the 26th of November, 1980, production resumed. The men had won. It was one of the very few clear victories against mass redundancy anywhere in Britain in those years. 2,500 letters of thanks were sent out to the unions and organisations that had stood with Patricroft. For one cold autumn, the works that built the engine that ran forever had refused to die. But a victory is not the same as a future. The tide that had been turned in the yard could not be turned in the market. Through the months that followed came short-time working. By July of 1981, the large majority of the workforce was down to 2 days a week. In August, 500 redundancies, 410 on the floor, 90 in the offices. The number was fought down to 365, most of it taken through voluntary severance and redeployment. The company, bitter at the resistance, accused the Works Committee of being a malignant minority chasing revolutionary ends. The men had saved their jobs once. They could not save them from the thing that was actually killing the firm, which was not a redundancy notice from Hawker Siddeley at all. It was the slow, quiet decision of every haulier in Britain to buy a different engine. Chapter 10. The gates fall, silent. Now the blows came from outside, and they came together. The British truck industry, that had carried Gardner for half a century, was itself dying. ERF, never a giant, saw its home sales fall to just 1,083 trucks in 1981. Atkinson had been absorbed into Seddon Atkinson, which passed through American hands and then to a Spanish group. The recession of the early 80s was, in ERF's own word, catastrophic, as DAF and Volvo and Scania took the market from the continent. Gardner's customers could no longer carry Gardner. Soon they would not even try. By 1990, ERF and Seddon Atkinson had taken Gardner engines off their options lists altogether. The mark ERF was born to carry no longer offered it at all. Then the last stronghold fell. The bus, the Transport Act of 1985, deregulated Britain's buses from the 26th of October 1986, and new bus orders collapsed, and the bus was the one place a Gardner was still the standard choice. New orders went, in one account, from a flow to a trickle. In the summer of 1986, after months of denial, Gardner was bought by Perkins of Peterborough, chiefly to get at its spares and after-sales business. The mismatch tells you everything. Perkins built some 385,000 engines a year. Gardner, by now, built a handful. The truck engine business had fallen so far that production was simply stopped until the October, and then the law itself closed the door. The first European emission standards arrived in the early 1990s, and it was simply too expensive to re-engineer the long-running 6 LXB to meet them. There was no money and no will to make the old engine legal for a new age. Automotive engine production ceased in 1994. That same year, when the firm Lucas Varity acquired Perkins, it closed the Gardner brand and sold off the Barton Hall works at Patricroft. The end was not a single date, whatever the headlines later said. It was a phased going out. The truck engines in 1986, the automotive and bus engines in 1994, the works sold the same year. A wind down, slow and quiet, the way a great engine winds down when the fuel is finally cut, turning over more and more slowly, the beat lengthening until it stops. 126 years after a brass plate went up on a cellar wall in Hume, the mark was extinguished. Chapter 11. The sound that remains. The site is still there if you know where to look. Off the M60, the Barton Hall Works has become an industrial estate. Anonymous commercial units where the test shops used to be. Paul Gardner, the nephew who had seen the future and been ordered to stop, ran a remanufacturing operation from within the old plant for some years, until it too folded around 2011. There is no blue plaque on the gate, no memorial to the men who once approached 3,000 strong. The firm's true memorial was never going to be a brass sign. It was always going to be the engines, and the engines refused to die. In Canterbury, a firm called Gardner Marine. Diesels works with the original Gardner machinery, the original tooling, the original procedures, holding over 100,000 spare parts and rebuilding the old engines, in their own words, to as new, factory-supplied condition. It was founded by a man named Michael Harrison, whose father had spent most of his working life at the original company. The son keeps alive what the father built. Other specialists, Gardner Parts, Gardner Enthusiast, who will still manufacture you a piston ring or a casting. Firms like Tangent Engineering that devote themselves wholly to these engines, keep them running across the world. And at Poynton in Cheshire, on the site of a former colliery, run by volunteers and fueled by nothing but enthusiasm, the Anson Engine Museum holds one of the finest collections of Gardner engines anywhere. Everything from a marine engine of 1908 to the 350 horsepower 6LYT, the late troubled, turbocharged engine that came too late to save the firm, now preserved with as much love as all the rest. On their engine days, they start them up, and the visitors hear it again. That slow, deliberate, almost musical beat, the soft tick at idle, opening into the smooth thrum under load. The sound that half of Britain once lived alongside without ever knowing its name. Somewhere out on the water, a 6LXB built in 1975, pulled from a Thames barge, chosen after 2 years of one owner's research as the engine that would simply never let him down, is pushing a small expedition vessel halfway around the world, still running, still doing the one thing it was built, above all else, to do. That is the strange shape of this ending. Hugh Gardner refused to turbocharge because he believed, above everything, in the engine that would last. And he was right about the engine. It does last. It lasts in narrowboats and fishing boats and preserved buses and a generator behind the waltzers at a travelling fair. It lasts in a museum where volunteers turn it over so that strangers can hear what their grandfathers heard. The engine he built to outlive everything has outlived the company that built it. He was right about the engine and wrong about the world. And in the gap between those two truths, an empire that had survived 2 world wars, a depression, the death of its founder, and the wholesale remaking of British transport finally came apart, not through one catastrophe, but through a single, principled refusal, compounded by the dying of its customers and the loss of its name. The works at Patricroft is quiet now, but on a clear day at a rally field, or a museum yard, or somewhere on a canal where a narrowboat is easing past, you can still hear it, the engine that would run forever, running still. Long after the men who built it and the works that made it, and the firm that bore the family name, have all fallen silent.